I thought I knew everything about my family's history until a simple DNA test shattered everything I believed about my father's identity. My name is Sarah. I'm 34 years old, and I've always been obsessed with family history.
Wow.
Growing up in small-town Ohio, our family was everything to me. My dad, Robert, was this larger-than-life figure who could tell stories for hours about our Irish heritage. He'd sit me on his knee when I was little and spin tales about our great-great-grandfather, who supposedly came over during the potato famine with nothing but determination and a lucky shamrock in his pocket. Dad was born in 1965 to what he always told us were his biological parents, Margaret and James Sullivan. They lived in Boston, he said, and both died in a car accident when he was just 22. It was tragic, he explained, which is why he never liked talking about it much. He had no siblings, no extended family to speak of, just a few faded photographs and some old documents he'd kept in a shoebox under his bed. The story was consistent, never changing. Margaret was a school teacher with bright red hair and freckles, just like mine. James worked at the docks and had these piercing blue eyes that my dad inherited, and that I got too. Dad would describe their modest apartment in South Boston, the smell of his mother's Irish stew, the way his father would come home tired, but always had energy to throw a baseball with him in the tiny backyard. I never questioned any of it. Why would I? These weren't just stories to me, they were my identity. I named my daughter Margaret after my supposed great-grandmother. I got a shamrock tattoo on my ankle when I turned 18. I even took Irish dancing lessons in college because I wanted to connect with my roots. My dad would beam with pride watching me perform, always saying I had the Sullivan spirit. Our family was tight-knit in that special way that happens when you don't have extended relatives. It was just Dad, Mom, my younger brother Mike, and me. Dad worked as a mechanic, Mom was a nurse, and we lived in this cozy ranch house with a big oak tree in the front yard. Every Sunday, Dad would make what he called Sullivan pancakes. Basically regular pancakes but with extra butter, because that est how his mother supposedly made them. The thing is, Dad was such a convincing storyteller. He had this way of making you feel like you were right there with him in those memories. He'd describe the sound of the trolley cars in Boston, the way the harbor smelled on foggy mornings, the corner store where his father would buy him penny candy. He painted such vivid pictures that I felt like I could navigate those Boston streets myself. When I got older and started college, I became fascinated with genealogy. This was right around the time when ancestry websites were becoming popular, and I spent countless hours building our family tree online. Dad would help sometimes, dictating details about dates and places, though he'd often get quiet when we talked about his parents. I assumed it was still painful for him, losing them so young. I managed to trace some records back to Ireland, found what I thought were our ancestors in County Cork. I even planned a trip there during my junior year of college. Walking through old cemeteries and taking pictures of headstones with the Sullivan name, I felt this deep spiritual connection to the place. When I came back and showed Dad the photos, he got emotional, tears in his eyes as he looked at the green hills and stone cottages. "That's where we come from, honey," he'd said, holding the photos with shaking hands. "That's our people." My obsession with family history only grew stronger when I got married and had kids of my own. I wanted my children to know their heritage, to understand the struggles and triumphs of the generations before them. I started a family blog sharing stories about our Irish ancestors, posting old photos that Dad had given me, and writing about our traditions. Dad was always supportive, but never wanted to be too involved in the research himself. He'd say things like, "The past is the past, Sarah. Sometimes it's better to focus on the family we're building now." I thought it was just his way of dealing with the grief of losing his parents so young. He was in his 50s by then, successful in his work, a devoted grandfather to my kids. But I could see that sadness in his eyes whenever we talked about his childhood. The family stories became even more important to me after my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 30. Suddenly, medical history mattered in a way it never had before. I started asking Dad more detailed questions about his parents' health, any genetic conditions that might run in our family. He was vague, saying he was too young to remember much about their medical issues, but he thought they were both pretty healthy before the accident. That's when I first considered getting one of those DNA tests. It's not because I doubted anything. I just wanted to build a more complete picture of our family's health history. and maybe connect with distant relatives who might have more information about the Sullivan line. It seemed like such an innocent idea at the time, just another tool for my genealogy research. Dad wasn't enthusiastic about the idea, but he didn't object either. "If it makes you happy, sweetheart," he'd said with a shrug, "just remember that family isn't really about DNA. It's about the people who love you and stick by you." I should have paid more attention to that comment. The first crack in my perfect family narrative came from the most unexpected place. My 4-year-old daughter, Emma. Kids have this brutal honesty that adults learn to suppress. We were looking through old family photos one afternoon, the same ones Dad had always shown me, when she picked up the picture of his supposed parents, Margaret and James. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandpa look like his mom and dad?" she asked, tilting her head with that curious way children do when something doesn't make sense to them. I glanced at the photo, the same one I'd looked at hundreds of times before. Margaret was fair with light red hair and pale skin. James was also light-complexioned with those striking blue eyes. But now, seeing it through Emma's innocent eyes, something struck me for the first time. My dad had olive skin, dark brown hair, and while his eyes were blue, his bone structure was completely different. His nose was broader, his jawline stronger, his overall features more Mediterranean than Irish. "Sometimes kids don't look exactly like their parents, honey," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I felt a strange uneasiness settling in my stomach. That night I found myself staring at those photos again. How had I never noticed this before? I'd always focused on the eyes. Dad and James both had blue eyes, and I'd inherited them too. But now I was seeing everything else. The way Dad's skin tanned easily, while the people in the photos looked like they'd de-burn in 5 minutes of sunshine. The completely different facial structure. The way his hands were broader and more muscular than the slim fingers visible in James's photo. I started paying attention to other inconsistencies I'd previously overlooked. Dad's stories about Boston, while vivid, always seemed to focus on the same few locations. When I'd try to get him to elaborate on specific neighborhoods or streets, he'd change the subject, or say his memory was fuzzy. I'd always attributed this to trauma from losing his parents, but now I wondered if there was another explanation. Then there was the accent issue. Dad had never had even a trace of a Boston accent, despite supposedly living there until he was 22. When I'd asked about this before, he said he'd worked hard to lose it when he moved to Ohio, wanting to fit in better. At the time, that seemed reasonable. People do change their accents, but combined with everything else, it was starting to feel like another piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. I became obsessed, going through every document Dad had ever shown us. The birth certificate looked legitimate, but something about it felt off. The papers seemed too new. Too clean for something supposedly issued in 1965. The death certificates for Margaret and James were similarly pristine, with no signs of age or where you'd expect from documents that had been handled and referenced over decades. My brother Mike thought I was losing my mind when I brought up my concerns. "Sarah, you're being paranoid," he said during one of our weekly phone calls. Dad's always been consistent about his story. Oh, why would he lie about something like that? And what would be the point? That was the question that haunted me. What would be the point? Dad was a good man, a loving father and grandfather. He'd never given us any reason to doubt his honesty about anything else. But the more I looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, the more inconsistencies I found. I started doing more intensive online research, looking for any record of Margaret and James Sullivan in Boston during the 1940s and 1960s. The internet had become much more comprehensive since my college days, with more historical records digitized and searchable. But I found nothing. No marriage records, no census data, no obituaries matching their names and supposed death date. It was as if they'd never existed. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner that year. Dad was telling my kids the same stories he'd told me about their great-great-grandfather's journey from Ireland. My son, who was 7, and in that phase where he questioned everything, asked Dad what ship his great-grandfather had come over on. Dad paused, fork halfway to his mouth, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Panic flashed across his face. It was just for a split second, but it was there. "Oh, he said, forcing a laugh. "I don't remember the name of the ship. It was a long time ago." "But Grandpa," my son persisted with the relentless logic of a child, You said he told you stories about the ship? Wouldn't he tell you the name? Tommy, eat your turkey, my mom interjected, but I was watching Dad carefully now. He was sweating, actually sweating, over what should have been a simple question about family lore. That night, after everyone went to bed, I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. All those years of family stories, all those details that had shaped my identity, and suddenly they felt like an elaborate fiction. But why? What could possibly have happened that would require such an extensive cover-up? I thought about all the genealogy research I'd done, how I'd never been able to find concrete documentation for anything Dad had told us. I'd always attributed the gaps to lost records, fires in courthouses, the general difficulty of tracing immigrant families. But now I wondered if the records didn't exist because the people had never existed. The most unsettling part was realizing how much of my own identity was built on what might be lies. The Ireland trip, the shamrock tattoo, the Irish dancing, naming my daughter Margaret, all of it based on stories that were starting to feel like elaborate fiction. I felt like I was losing my grip on who I was, like the foundation of my entire sense of self was crumbling beneath me. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to take that DNA test, not just for genealogy research anymore, but to find the truth about who we really were. The decision to take the DNA test wasn't made lightly. I spent weeks agonizing over it, going back and forth between feeling ridiculous for doubting my father and feeling like I was going crazy ignoring all the inconsistencies I discovered. The rational part of my brain kept saying I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into innocent explanations. But the investigative part of me, the part that had always been drawn to solving puzzles and uncovering truth, couldn't let it go. I researched different DNA testing companies obsessively. Ancestridna, 23, Antime, Family Tredna. I read reviews, compared features, looked at their databases and matching capabilities. I wasn't just looking for health information anymore. I was looking for answers about identity, about truth. I needed something comprehensive, something that would connect me with as many potential relatives as possible. The hardest part was deciding whether to tell Dad what I was planning. Part of me felt like I owed him that honesty. We'd always had an open relationship, and going behind his back felt like a betrayal. But another part of me knew that if there really was something he'd been hiding, giving him advance warning might give him time to come up with more explanations, more stories to maintain whatever facade he'd been building all these years. I finally decided to tell my mom first. She and I were in her kitchen one Saturday morning, both of us prepping vegetables for dinner, when I worked up the courage to bring it up. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "I've been thinking about taking one of those DNA tests. You know, for health reasons mainly, but also to see if I can connect with any distant relatives." She looked up from the carrots she was chopping, and I saw something flicker across her face. It wasn't surprise exactly, but it wasn't enthusiasm either. "It's interesting, honey," she said carefully. "What made you decide to do that now?" I told her about my concerns regarding family medical history, especially after her own cancer diagnosis. I mentioned wanting to build a more complete picture for my kids' sake, but I didn't tell her about the growing doubts, about Emma's innocent observation, about the inconsistencies that were keeping me awake at night. "Have you talked to your father about this?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully. "Not yet," I admitted. "I wanted to run it by you first. Do you think he'd be okay with it?" Mom was quiet for a long moment, focusing intently on her vegetables. Finally, she said, "Your father is a private person, Sarah. He doesn't like to dwell on the past, especially the painful parts. Maybe you should talk to him before you do anything." That conversation left me more confused than ever. There was something in my mom's reaction that felt off, like she was being careful with her words in a way that wasn't natural for her. Mom and I had always been straight shooters with each other. She wasn't typically evasive or diplomatic, but she'd been both of those things when I brought up the DNA test. I spent another week wrestling with the decision. I found myself studying Dad's face when he didn't know I was looking, searching for clues about his heritage that I might have missed all these years. His skin tone, his features, the way his hair grew, none of it screamed Irish to me anymore. If anything, he looked like he could have Italian or Greek ancestry, maybe Spanish. His hands were broad and strong, his build stockier than the slim man in the photographs he claimed was his father. The turning point came when I was helping him clean out his garage one weekend. We were going through old boxes, sorting things to donate or throw away. when I came across a small wooden chest I'd never seen before. It was tucked behind some old paint cans, covered in dust like it had been there for years. "What's this, Dad?" I asked, pulling it out. The reaction was immediate and startling. Dad practically lunged for the chest, taking it from my hands with more force than necessary. "Oh, that's just some old junk," he said, but his face had gone pale. "Nothing important. We can just toss it." But I'd seen something in that split second before he'd grabbed it from me. The chest wasn't locked, and when I'd lifted it, the lid had shifted slightly. Inside, I'd glimpsed what looked like different photographs, documents that didn't match the pristine papers he'd always shown us. There was a different name on something, though I hadn't been able to read it clearly. "Dad," I said gently, "if there's something you need to tell me, you can. You know that, right?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe, or sadness so deep it made my chest ache. For just a second, I thought he was going to say something. He was going to finally tell me whatever truth he'd been carrying all these years. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "There's nothing to tell, sweetheart. Just your old dad being sentimental about stuff that doesn't matter anymore." That night I ordered the DNA test. I chose Ancestradna because they had the largest database and the best reputation for connecting people with relatives. As I filled out the online form, entering my credit card information and shipping address, my hands were actually shaking. I felt like I was about to open Pandora's box, like whatever I found out might change everything about my family forever. The kit arrived 3 days later in a small, discreet box. Inside was a simple tube for saliva collection and instructions that seemed almost anticlimactically straightforward for something that might shatter everything I thought I knew about my identity. I stared at that tube for 2 days before I finally worked up the courage to use it. When I finally spit into the tube and sealed it up, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. Whatever the truth was, I was finally going to find it. The waiting period was supposed to be 6 to 8 weeks, and I knew those were going to be the longest weeks of my life. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. While I was getting the kids ready for school, I was in that chaotic breakfast rush, packing lunches and hunting for lost homework, when my phone buzzed with a notification that made my heart stop. "Your Ancestradna results are ready." I stared at that email for a full 10 seconds, while my 7-year-old tugged on my sleeve asking where his math worksheet was, and my 4-year-old spilled orange juice across the kitchen table. The normal Tuesday morning chaos continued around me, but I felt like I was suddenly watching it from underwater, everything muffled and surreal. "Mommy, you look funny," Emma said, tilting her head at me with that concerned expression kids get when they sense something's wrong with the adult world. I forced myself back to the moment, cleaned up the orange juice, found Tommy's worksheet, and got both kids out the door to school. But that email notification stayed with me like a physical weight in my chest. I drove to work in a daze, barely registering the familiar route, my mind racing with possibilities of what I might find. I couldn't concentrate on anything at the office. I work as a marketing coordinator for a local nonprofit, and I had a presentation due that afternoon, but I kept staring at my computer screen without processing any of the words. My coworker Janet asked me twice if I was feeling okay, and I made some excuse about not sleeping well. Finally, around lunchtime, I couldn't stand it anymore. I've locked my office door, took a deep breath, and opened the email on my phone. The first thing I saw was the ethnicity breakdown, and it hit me like a physical blow. According to my DNA, I was 38% Italian, 23% Greek, 15% Spanish, 12% Northern European, 8% Eastern European, and 4% Middle Eastern. There wasn't a single trace of Irish ancestry anywhere in my genetic makeup, not 1%. I stared at those numbers until they blurred, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. 34 years of believing I was Irish, of building my identity around stories of potato famine ancestors and lucky shamrocks. And I didn't have a drop of Irish blood in my body, but that was just the beginning. The real shock came when I clicked on the DNA matches section. The closest match was labeled as a close family, first cousin with a confidence level of extremely high. The name was Anthony Ricci, and he shared 987 centimorgans of DNA with me. I'd done enough genealogy research to know what that meant. Someone sharing that much DNA with me was definitely a first cousin, which meant one of his parents and one of my parents were siblings. But according to everything I'd ever been told, my dad had no siblings, no extended family at all. With shaking fingers, I clicked on Anthony's profile. He had uploaded a family tree, and what I saw there made me feel like I was going to be sick. His father was listed as Michael Ricci, born in 1959. His grandparents were Giuseppe and Maria Ricci, who had immigrated from Italy in the 1940s and settled in Philadelphia. The dates lined up perfectly. If Michael Ricci was born in 1959 and was my dad's brother, that would make my dad part of the Ricci family, not the Sullivan family he'd always claimed. The Italian heritage in my DNA results suddenly made perfect sense. I scrolled through more matches, finding dozens of people with Italian surnames: Ricci, Romano, Benedetti, Castellano. People who appeared to be my second and third cousins, all with family trees that traced back to the same regions of Italy where my DNA said I had ancestry. There were recent photographs, family reunions, detailed genealogies going back generations. These weren't the lost records and faded photographs of my supposed Irish heritage. This was a living, breathing, documented family that I'd never known existed. The most shocking discovery came when I found a match labeled as possible grandmother, with a woman named Rose Ricci Romano. According to her profile, she was 89 years old and living in a nursing home in South Jersey. She had uploaded photos, including one that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a picture of her as a young woman, probably in her 20s, holding a baby. The resemblance was unmistakable. She had my eyes, my nose, my facial structure, but more importantly, the baby in the photograph looked exactly like my dad as an infant. I'd seen enough baby pictures of him to recognize that same stubborn cowlick, those same chubby cheeks. The caption under the photo read, "Me with my youngest son Roberto before the adoption, 1965. Roberto, not Robert Sullivan, but Roberto Ricci. I sat in my locked office, staring at that photograph, and felt 34 years of my life rearrange themselves in my mind. My dad wasn't an orphan who'd lost his parents in a tragic accident. He was adopted, given up by this woman who was apparently still alive, still living just a few hours away from us. The Margaret and James Sullivan story, the Irish heritage, the tragic car accident, all of it was fiction. My dad had created an entire false identity, complete with fake documents and manufactured memories. But why? What had happened that made him feel like he needed to erase his entire biological family from existence? I tried to call my mom, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. When she answered, I couldn't even form words at first. "Mom," I finally managed to choke out, "I need to come home. We need to talk about Dad." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Finally," she said quietly, "you took the DNA test, didn't you?" The way she said it, with resignation instead of surprise, told me everything I needed to know. She'd known. Maybe not all the details, but she'd known there were secrets. Known there was more to Dad's story than what he'd told us. That afternoon, driving home from work early, with my DNA results printed out and sitting on the passenger seat beside me, I realized that I was about to have the most difficult conversation of my life. I found Dad in his usual spot after work, sitting in his recliner in the living room, watching the evening news with a beer in his hand. He looked so normal, so perfectly like the father I'd known my entire life, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Maybe there was some other explanation for the DNA results, some mistake or coincidence that would make all of this make sense without shattering everything I thought I knew. But then he looked up at me, and I saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew why I was there. Maybe it was something in my expression, or maybe he'd been dreading this moment for years, but he knew. "We need to talk," I said, holding up the printed DNA results. The color drained from his face. He reached for the remote and turned off the TV, then sat there for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were filled with a sadness, so deep it took my breath away. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. "I know your name isn't Robert Sullivan," I said, sitting down across from him. "I know you're Roberto Ricci, and I know you have a family in Philadelphia that you've never told us about. I know Margaret and James Sullivan never existed." He flinched at each revelation like I was hitting him. When I finished, he closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "I know you have a mother who's still alive," I added, more gently this time. "Rose Ricci Romano. She's 89 years old and living in New Jersey." That's when he broke down. This man who I'd never seen cry, who'd been the rock of our family through every crisis, started sobbing like a child. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. I went to him instinctively, kneeling beside his chair and putting my arms around him. Even though I was furious and hurt and confused, "I'm sorry," he kept saying through his tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for it to go on this long. I never meant to lie to you kids." When he finally composed himself enough to talk, the story came out in pieces, interrupted by more tears and long silences, where he seemed to be gathering courage to continue. He told me that Rose hadn't given him up by choice. She was 17 when she got pregnant, unmarried, and her family was traditional Italian Catholic. The shame of having a baby out of wedlock was too much for them to bear. Her father, my great-grandfather, had forced her to give up the baby for adoption. "She wanted to keep me," Dad said, his voice breaking. "She fought for me, but she was just a kid herself, with no money, no support. Her family cut her off completely when she refused to name the father. He was adopted by a family named Sullivan in Boston, but it wasn't the loving home he'd always described. The Sullivans were older, strict, and had adopted him more out of duty than desire. They never let him forget that he wasn't their biological child, that he should be grateful for what they'd given him. They weren't abusive," he said quickly, "but they weren't warm either. I always felt like I was living with strangers, like I was just temporarily staying in their house until my real family came to get me." When he turned 18, he'd used what little money he'd saved to hire a private investigator to find his birth mother. That's how he learned about Rose, about the Ritchie family, about his Italian heritage. But when he tried to contact them, he discovered that Rose had gotten married and started a new family. She'd had other children and had never told her husband or her other kids about the baby she'd given up. "I called once," he said, staring at the wall behind me. Rose answered the phone. When I told her who I was, she started crying. She said she'd never stopped thinking about me, never stopped regretting giving me up. But she also said that if her husband found out, it would destroy her marriage. Her other children didn't know about me. The conversation had lasted only a few minutes. Rose had begged him not to contact the family again, not to disrupt the life she'd built. She'd told him she loved him, that she'd never wanted to give him up, but that too much time had passed for them to have a relationship now. "So I decided to disappear," Dad said. "I legally changed my name from Roberto Ricci to Robert Sullivan. I created a whole new identity, a whole new family history. I told myself it would be easier that way, cleaner. No complicated family dynamics, no painful history to explain. The Sullivan adoption story, the tragic car accident, the Irish heritage. He'd invented all of it to explain why he had no family, no relatives to visit or invite to holidays. It had started as a simple lie to avoid difficult conversations, but it had grown over the years into an elaborate mythology, and Mom knew." He nodded miserably. "I told her everything when we got engaged. I couldn't marry her with lies between us. She said it didn't matter, that we'd build our own family together. But as you kids got older and started asking questions, the lies just got more and more complicated. I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't even begin to sort through. Anger at being lied to my entire life. Sadness for my father, who'd been rejected by 2 families. Confusion about my own identity. And underneath it all, strange sense of relief that there was finally an explanation for all the inconsistencies that had been bothering me. "Dad," I said finally, "you have family. You have brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews. I have cousins I've never met. How could you keep us from all of that?" "'Cause I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid they wouldn't want me. Afraid they'd reject me all over again. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd think less of me for being the kid nobody wanted." That's when I realized that this confrontation wasn't going to end with anger or accusations. It was going to end with a choice about what kind of family we wanted to be going forward. The weeks following that conversation were some of the strangest of my life. It's one thing to intellectually understand that your family history is different than you thought. It's another thing entirely to feel it in your bones. To look in the mirror and see Italian features instead of Irish ones. To suddenly understand why you've always craved garlic bread and why your skin tans easily in the summer. But more than the personal identity shift, I was grappling with a much bigger question. What do we do now? Dad was terrified about reaching out to the Ricci family. What if they don't want anything to do with me, he kept saying. What if I'm just this painful reminder of something they'd rather forget? I understood his fear, but I also couldn't shake the image of Rose in that photograph, the way she'd looked at baby Roberto with such obvious love. The caption had said before the adoption, "Not giving away my unwanted baby." There was a story there that was more complex than shame and rejection. After a lot of soul-searching and family discussions that included my mom and brother, I decided to take the first step. I reached out to Anthony Ritchie, my DNA-matched cousin, through the Ancestry website's messaging system. I was honest but careful. "Hi, Anthony. I'm Sarah, and according to our DNA match, we appear to be first cousins. I have reason to believe your father Michael and my father might be brothers. My father was adopted in 1965, and we're just now learning about his biological family. Would you be willing to talk?" Anthony responded within hours, and his message made me cry. "Sarah, we've been wondering about you for decades. My grandmother at Rose has never stopped talking about the baby she gave up. She has a picture of him on her nightstand and says a prayer for him every night. She's going to be over the moon to know he's okay and has a family." The family reunion happened 3 months later on a sunny Saturday in May at Anthony's house in South Jersey. I convinced Dad to come with me, though he was so nervous he barely spoke during the 2-hour drive. Walking up to that front door was surreal. I was about to meet grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins I'd never known existed. Inside that house were people who shared my DNA, my facial features, my love of loud conversation and good food, but who were complete strangers to me. Rose was waiting in the living room, sitting in a wheelchair, but with eyes that were sharp and bright. When Dad walked through the door, she took one look at him and started crying. "Roberto," she said, reaching out her arms. "Mio bambino." Watching my 60-year-old father collapse into the arms of the 89-year-old mother who gave him up was one of the most emotionally powerful moments of my life. They held each other and sobbed, and everyone else in the room was crying too. The story Rose told us filled in gaps I didn't even know existed. She'd gotten pregnant with Roberto when she was 17, by a boy her family disapproved of. When she'd refused to marry someone they'd chosen for her, they'd essentially disowned her during the pregnancy. She'd lived in a home for unwed mothers, worked as a seamstress to pay for her keep, and had planned to somehow make it work as a single mother. "But they wouldn't let me," she said, holding Dad's hand like she was afraid he might disappear again. My father said the family's reputation was more important than one bastard child. He signed the papers while I was still recovering from the birth. She'd spent the next 70 years wondering what happened to her firstborn son, carrying guilt and grief that had shaped every day of her life. She'd had 3 more children, Michael, Anna, and Joseph, and had been a good mother to them. But she'd never stopped mourning Roberto. "I used to drive to Philadelphia sometimes," she admitted, "just hoping maybe I'd see you on the street." I knew it was crazy, but I couldn't stop myself. The reunion was overwhelming in the best possible way. I met Uncle Michael, who looked so much like my dad it was startling. Met Aunt Anna, who had my same laugh and talked with her hands just like I do. Uncle Joseph, quiet but kind, who worked as a chef and immediately started planning a feast for us. I learned that I had 12 cousins spread across 3 states, most of them with children of my own kids' ages. There were family traditions I'd never known about, recipes passed down through generations, stories about great-grandparents who'd immigrated from Sicily with nothing but hope and determination. The most healing part was watching my dad come alive in a way I'd never seen. With the Ricci family, he wasn't the man who'd invented an identity to avoid difficult conversations. He was Roberto again, the baby who'd been loved but given away, the son who'd been missed and mourned for 70 years. We started having regular family dinners, big loud Italian gatherings where everyone talked at once, and the table was always overflowing with food. My kids got to know their great-grandmother Rose, who spoiled them with homemade cookies and stories about the old country. Dad learned to make his grandmother's sauce recipe, the one he'd never known existed. It wasn't all perfect, of course. There were awkward moments, cultural differences to navigate, and the reality that you can't just insert yourself into a family after 60 years and expect everything to be seamless. Some of the extended family members were more welcoming than others. There were questions about inheritance, about why Dad had never tried harder to find them, about the fake identity he'd maintained for decades. But the love was real, and it was bigger than the complications. Rose lived for another 2 years after our reunion. Those were 2 years filled with Sunday dinners and birthday parties and holiday. Celebrations where she got to be the grandmother she'd always dreamed of being to Dad's children and grandchildren. When she passed away, Dad was holding her hand. Her last words to him were "Ti amo sempre, Roberto." "I have always loved you, Roberto." He'd spent 60 years thinking he was unwanted, and she'd spent 70 years thinking she was unforgivable. The DNA test didn't just reveal our ancestry. It healed wounds that had been festering for decades. The experience changed how I think about family, about truth, about the stories we tell ourselves. I used to think family was about shared history, about knowing where you came from and carrying forward the traditions of your ancestors. Now I understand that family is more complicated and more beautiful than that. Dad will always be my father, whether his name is Robert Sullivan or Roberto Ricci. The love he gave me, the values he taught me, the man he chose to be, none of that was diminished by learning the truth about his origins. If anything, understanding his story made me love him more, made me see his strength in surviving 2 rejections and still managing to be the kind of father and grandfather who makes his family feel wanted and valued. I still have the shamrock tattoo on my ankle, and I'm not planning to cover it up. It might not represent my actual genetic heritage, but it represents 34 years of believing I was part of something bigger than myself. That belief shaped me, gave me strength, connected me to stories of survival and hope. The fact that those particular stories weren't literally true doesn't make their impact on my life any less real. My kids now know they're Italian and Irish in spirit, if not in DNA. They're learning to make Rose's meatball recipe and Uncle Joseph's tiramisu. They're hearing stories about great-great-grandparents who came to America with nothing but dreams, just like I always told them. Except now the stories are true, and the great-great-grandparents were from Sicily instead of County Cork. The DNA test results sit in a frame in our kitchen now, not as a source of shame or confusion, but as a reminder that truth is more powerful than fiction, that love is stronger than fear, and that it's never too late to come home to the people who've been waiting for you. Sometimes I think about all the years we lost, all the Sunday dinners and birthday parties and graduations that the Ricci family missed, because Dad was too afraid to reach out. But then I remember Rose's face when she saw him again. The way she lit up when my kids called her Nona, the way she'd pat his cheek and say, "You're here now, that's all that matters." Family isn't just about DNA, but DNA can lead you back to family you never knew you'd lost. Sometimes the most important truth isn't the one you've been told your whole life, it's the one you have the courage to discover for yourself. Now, when I look at my children, I see not just the man who raised me with Irish stories and shamrock pancakes, but also the grandmother who prayed for a lost grandson every night for 70 years. The uncles who welcomed us with open arms, the cousins who share our laugh and our love of talking with our hands. I see a family that's both chosen and given, both fictional and real, both lost and found. And in the end, that's the most beautiful DNA story of all, the one where love wins over fear, truth wins over fiction, and family finds a way to heal itself across decades of separation and silence.